Hello, my name is Will Kaufman, and I'm a professor of American literature and culture at the University of Central Lancashire in Preston, England. And I'm the author of American Song and Struggle from Columbus to World War II. Music has always been very important to me at a very personal level. I grew up in a musical household in Montclair, New Jersey. My father was a jazz musician, my mother was a classical musician, but they were also very politically active and they were on the social periphery of people like Pete Seeger and the Weavers, who they knew. And so, in addition to jazz music and classical music, there was always the protest music around. The records were always there. Seeger, the Weavers, Woody Guthrie, Joan Baez, Odetta, Harry Belafonte. So that was part of the milieu that I grew up in. And also Broadway shows, Broadway cast albums. I just absorbed those when I was growing up, mostly through my mother. And in fact, it was music, I would say, that turned me into a historian because when I was very young, back in the 1970s, I saw the Broadway musical 1776. And that actually fired up my passion not only for history, but for history through song. And then I became a musician myself, a bluegrass musician, then a folk musician, and I began singing more and more songs of struggle coming out of the American tradition. And really, that's where it all took off, and I haven't looked back since. Well, when I came to England in the 1980s, obviously I was still thinking about music then, and I was playing, performing in various folk clubs. But I also began to think about music as a means of coping with the fact of being an expatriate at a very difficult time. This was the late 80s, the early 90s, when American voices coming out of Washington could be quite belligerent. They could be, I think, quite domineering. And I'm looking for an alternative American voice that I could say, this is the voice of another America. This is the voice of my America. And I began thinking more and more and more critically about Woody Guthrie. I was singing his songs, but never really thinking about how much he actually meant to me. And I realized that he meant a hell of a lot to me. Bob Dylan once said that you could listen to Woody Guthrie songs and learn how to live. Well, I never took it that far. I never hopped any freight trains or anything like that. But I began to listen to Woody Guthrie as the kind of American voice that I would like to broadcast. I became more and more interested in him. I began researching him. I wrote 3 books about him, and I put together a number of performance pieces about him that I took to venues all over Europe and the United States, right up until the pandemic stopped me from doing it in 2019. But a particular thing happened about the year of Woody Guthrie's centenary, 2012. And that's when I began hearing people refer to Woody as the father of American protest music, the first singer-songwriter, the first protest songwriter. And, well, as a historian, I knew that that wasn't true. And I knew that Woody had a whole tradition to build upon. And I wanted to begin exploring that tradition, that period that I call BG, before Guthrie, right? So that's really what this book is. It's an exploration of songs of struggle in America in the period BG, which is basically from the period of the Columbian encounter right up to Woody's emergence on the eve of World War II. Well, the distinction between protest songs and songs of struggle really is fundamental to this book and fundamental to the way that I began to think about the place of song in American history. First of all, there's no, I don't think there's any universally agreed definition about what a protest song is. I mean, you can dance on the head of a pin, I think, trying to define a protest song. What does it need? Does it need an identifiable target? Do you have to name names? Is it what Bob Dylan called a finger pointing song, which he called quite derisively? So I think protest songs are part of what I'm writing about, but they are not the totality. There's something bigger. There's something broader, deeper, and that really, for me, is struggle. Songs of struggle. For instance, uh, you take the classic protest song of the Depression, which is Yip Harburg and Jay Gorney's "Brother, Can You Spare a Dime?" Let's say. Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime? Well, okay, it is a song of struggle, a struggle for access to various things, but who who's the pro who's the object of protest? What is the object of protest? Once in khaki suits, gee, we look so well. Oh, that Yankee doodly dum. Once a million boots went slogging through hell, and I was the kid with a drum. Say, don't you remember they called me Al? Well, it was Al all the time. Sure you remember, don't you? I'm your pal. Buddy, can you spare a dime? Who's the object of that song? Is it Buddy? Is it the one who can give you a dime? I don't think so. So it is more of a song of struggle, I think, than a song of protest. Protest is part of it. But even Woody Guthrie himself, when he was proposing an album concept for his producer Moses Ash, he said, "I want a record, but it's not about protest. It's about struggle. The struggles of Americans, the struggles of the working people of America to gain access to what they deserve, what they need, and what makes them who they are, and gives them a reason for being and a reason for pride, and all of these things. It's struggle. Struggle is bigger than protest. So that's really what I wanted to explore in this book. Well, I looked everywhere for my sources. First of all, I wanted to make sure that I would be crossing all kinds of boundaries of musical genre, because um, folk music, singer-songwriter music is usually what is considered to be uh, the repository of songs of struggle or protest music, if you want to call it that. But I wanted to look at all kinds of music, wherever there was music and wherever there was song. That was fair game for me. So I would first look at many political and cultural and musical histories. I would look in biographies, song collections, obscure song books, online repositories. In particular, also places where you wouldn't normally think that you could find musical references, but they're there. So the Aztec codices, the writings of the conquistadors, they talk about song there. They sometimes replicate songs. Indigenous songs of struggle. That was something that's a thread that runs through the book, is indigenous American music well into the 20th century. I would look in colonial journals and reports, Puritan uh, broadsides and newspaper ballads, printed sheet music, opera, operetta, art songs. Uh, work songs, spirituals, suffrage songs, parlor songs, minstrel songs, songs from the minstrel stage, ragtime songs, vaudeville, cabaret, musical theater songs, and not only in the English language, but songs from the Yiddish theater, songs from the German American theater, the Italian American theater, Chinese opera, um, Tin Pan Alley songs, war songs, peace songs, immigration songs, songs actually scrolled onto the walls of the Angel Island detention centers and also the Ellis Island barracks and detention centers. Songs of queer struggle, songs of really any place. My source material really was any place where I could find an indication of song being used as a means of carrying on a struggle, of coping with a struggle, used to reflect the currents and the pressures of the struggles of American life. I was surprised by many things in the course of researching and writing this book. I was surprised, firstly, about. I was surprised by the the intense volume of silence, if you want, resounding silence in certain aspects of American musical history, the deafening historical silence surrounding early indigenous and African music in America, music which, as scholars have said, at the time that it was being sung, it must have resounded across the landscape. We can find very little references to it. Um, how do you reconstruct an Aztec song in response to the Spanish conquest? We have words, but we don't know what it sounded like. We have descriptions of African music, usually made by perplexed European observers. We don't know what it sounded like. Early indigenous music, we don't know what it sounded like, but we can find enough references to it to establish its importance. And I was surprised by the efforts of early U.S. authorities to silence indigenous song. The directives coming out of the Bureau of Indian Affairs really led directly to, I think, the massacre at Wounded Knee, which begins with the singing of the ghost dance songs and how the American authorities were terrified by that. The importance of music in combating not only slavery, but the importance of music um, in assisting in slave uprisings, in slave escaping, the enslaved escaping, the way in which songs are part of the coded messages enabling people to escape from the bonds of slavery, also indentured servitude as well. The relationship between song and American imperialism, not only across the continental U.S., but also amazing musical history coming out of the Spanish-American War of 1898, by which America acquires Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and the amount of music that came out of that, but also because of that imperial whirlwind where labor begins being imported from Puerto Rico into Hawaii. The Spanish-American War really enables America to secure its presence in the Pacific. It's not long before American interests overthrow the final monarch of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani, who herself was a songwriter, as was her brother. A lot of people don't realize that maybe the most famous Hawaiian song, Aloha Hoi, Aloha Hoi. Yeah, that was written by the last queen of Hawaii, overthrown by American planter interests and the likes of Sanford Dole, if you know about Dole peaches and pineapples. Well, that history begins in a pretty brutal and relentless takeover of Hawaii. Um, the planters begin importing into Hawaii Japanese laborers, women, to work in the sugarcane fields. They bring with them a whole body of labor songs called the Hole Hole Bushi, right? Um, Songs of LGBT struggle going way, way back. Um, there's a fella named Henry Saposnik, Hank Saposnik, a great musician and curator. He discovered the whole fellowship of black Jewish cantors who are asserting both their blackness and their Jewishness through song. That's an amazing discovery. And they're doing this, just when the Ku Klux Klan are writing their songs about the threatened mongrelization of American society and the destruction of the white race. Ku Klux Klan songs. Who'd have thunk it, right? Well, also some amazing musical conflicts that I wouldn't have known about. My wife is a Broadway veteran named Judy Blazer, and she toured for many years with Michael Tilson Thomas, the conductor, in a sort of a live documentary about his grandparents, Boris and Bessie Tomaszewski, who were the founders of one of the founders of American musical theater. And well, through Judy, of course, I learned a lot more about Yiddish theater. But then I came across an amazing conflict between Yiddish American theater, Yiddish musical theater, and early country music. Surrounding the Leo Frank case, where there was a bit of a sort of a dialogue, possibly, going on between Boris Tomaszewski and Fiddlin' John Carson, who are both singing about the lynching of this wrongfully imprisoned Jew in Georgia, Leo Frank. So those are just some of the really surprising things that I found in this research. I think there's a certain timelessness to many of these songs, even though they are located at particular moments of American history. They have a tendency to reassert their relevance. An example, when I was researching in the Woody Guthrie archives back, I guess it was about 2010, 2011, I came across a number of songs that Woody wrote condemning the racism of his Brooklyn landlord, whose name was Fred Trump. And I didn't think too much of it at the time. It was just, oh, isn't that interesting that reality TV star's father was Woody Guthrie's landlord. But then when Donald Trump announced his candidacy for the presidency, I thought, and he was talking about his father's legacy, his influence of his father on him, as he said, my legacy is my father's legacy. Or he said something like that. And I began thinking, well, Woody Guthrie had something to say about Donald Trump's father's legacy. And so I wrote about my discoveries and I published them. And all of a sudden, these songs that have been buried in the Woody Guthrie archives, they begin to be recorded and performed in public as a comment on the candidacy and then the presidency of Donald Trump. Woody Guthrie had no idea that those songs would be achieving a renewed relevance. I think when we are at a time now when the teaching of American history and the full panoply of American history is under threat, where books are being banned, where teachers are being beaten up because of their curricula that they are choosing, when children are being prevented from learning about their own history and the history of their country, this book is more timely than ever, I think, because you can't silence these voices. You know, I'm not sure this book is going to end up on any curriculum in Florida schools anytime soon, But that's beside the point. These songs will reassert themselves, and sometimes they will undergo their own transformations. I closed the book with Woody Guthrie writing This Land Is Your Land in 1940. Now, a lot of people think, oh, this is the great national anthem. Well, indigenous people do not think that. Indigenous people have seen This Land Is Your Land as, as a repository of a settler colonial uh, ideology or a mentality that refuses to acknowledge the theft of American land. Now, I came to that realization very late. I myself was such a champion of Woody Guthrie, and it really, I didn't begin thinking about it until an Abenaki folk musician named Mali Obumsawin wrote a real trenchant critique of This Land Is Your Land from an indigenous perspective. And, you know, I had to take my hat off and say, okay, I got to think about Woody's song again. You know, I have to think. And this is what happens. Well, this is what happens in an intellectual life or the life of a historian. You know, when people sneer at revisionist history, well, heck, all history is revisionist. Otherwise, it wouldn't be history. We'd be stuck back with the Peloponnesian War and Thucydides, you know? History is always revised, and so is our engagement with the song. So you can be singing, you know, this land is your land, this land is my land. You could be singing that. Or you could be singing, this land is your land, but it once was my land. Before we sold you Manhattan Island, you pushed my nation to the reservation. This land was stole by you from me. That was, by the way, written by Cappy Israel, who herself was not indigenous, but she had a sense of the silences of that song. There are other people who've taken that song and turned it into, I think, more of a capitalist critique than Woody even intended. This land is their land, it is not our land. From your plush apartment to your Cadillac car land, from your Wall Street office to your Hollywood star land. This land is not for you and me. Well, that song, This Land Is Your Land, has not seen the last of the discussions that it is going to engender. And I think that many of the songs that I have covered in this book are going to rear their heads again, and a new relevance is going to be made apparent depending on what's going on in the world outside of the song. But for now, I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.